Well, you read John sometimes and you start thinking a little bit of that Beatles song, John Lennon, you are me and I am you, and, I am the walrus, cuckoo, cuckoo. Not quite sure who's who and what's what. But when we try to pull apart what's going on in this last prayer of Jesus, the one thing that, of course, stands out, and we should hold that. I'm not going to preach on it today, but this idea that we are called to be one as Christ and the Father are one. So we're called to unity, which if Jesus' prayer is to the Father, it does not seem to have been granted, at least not yet. We are in many, many parts and many, many places pulled in different ways. But rather than preach on the hope and prayer for unity, I was struck because of the earlier reading in Acts as well, by the rather random nature that these texts seem to propose is the way of God on earth. As Milton wrote in Paradise Lost, I want to justify the ways of God to men. And he wrote a whole huge long poem saying, yep, it's all in the plan. Plan started with, however, a rebellion among angels. And even that was like, well, how come? How did this element of evil and this sense of randomness, this sense of chance, come into a world that we believe God has created and guides and is bringing to all fruition? Does it seem sometimes that is in great deal of tension with the chaotic and rather random nature of chance and fortune? We have a scene in the Acts of the Apostles in the beginning where the apostles go, there has to be 12 of us. Jesus appointed 12 and one's lost, Judas, who was destined to be lost because the scriptures said so how are we going to fill that spot? And they didn't yet have ranked voting, but they had this idea of the casting of lots. And they said, well, we have at least they had the criteria. You have to have been with us. You have to be a believer. You have to be a follower. We have at least 2 people who match that characterization. I have in front of me 6 people who are perfectly suited to serve on the vestry right now. And I'm just going to cast my dice. And you're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and whichever number comes up, you're the 12th person on our vestry because we need 12. Now, would you pray for it to be you or not? Every one of these apostles was martyred. And so maybe Justus got the lucky roll, and he just became a regular, just stayed a regular old follower. So we don't know. And it doesn't really tell us that God said to them, here's a good way to choose it. Choose by lot. Maybe God had a different plan after all. Maybe God was thinking, that crazy guy Saul who's going to persecute you, I'm going to make him the 12th apostle by calling him on the road to Damascus and speaking to him by name and saying, Paul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Become the apostle. And he called himself, an apostle. Maybe he was the 12th if there has to be 12. So I'm not convinced entirely that chance is exactly the way we ought to pick our leaders. Nor am I convinced entirely by John that the disciples are this select group chosen out of the world, and that the world is not sort of still mixed in with the process and with discipleship. And Jesus says, I am not of this world. But isn't that the whole purpose of becoming human, to become of this world as well as of heaven? And now that Jesus is going back to heaven, he's sort of leaving this contingent of people with 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the world. And he asks for God to protect them. He haven't lost any of them except the one destined to be lost. We have that same word. So first of all, that introduces this idea of, are some destined to be lost? Some to be chosen out of all and called to a special fate, a special discipleship? And what of all the rest in between that aren't perhaps destined to be Judas, but neither to be chosen to be an apostle, but rather, the rest of us, slobs like us, riding on the bus, as one of the songs goes. Well, I sort of think it's a mystery. When people talk about how do you reconcile the ways of God, the suffering of innocence, the existence of evil, the apparent randomness and chance of nature, why some get sick and some don't, some cured and some not, why does prayer work, how does it work? Those are all questions that we're tempted to resolve by God's ways are not our ways. God's thoughts, not our thoughts. It's above our pay grade to even sort of ask. Does the pot ask the potter, why are you making me? Jeremiah asked. And perhaps, fair enough, that's the final lesson of Job, right? He can't really answer the whirlwind. It's too much for human comprehension. It's a mystery. There's also something like Paul's line where all things work out for the good for those who believe. That perhaps if we had a little bit higher and better vision, we might understand how the good is being pulled out of even evil. And that is so helpful for us when we look back at our lives and see all the messed up things that we did and say, I guess those were making me who I am. And so they were necessary foolishness when we were young. And we look back at the transcendent moments of love and beauty, and we thank God for them, and we say, the heartbreaks and the scars that I'm bearing are part of that love and beauty too. And we can't really have the one without the other. So that the good and the hard are worked in together as we go through life. But you can't really, and Allison might speak to this also, tell somebody who's going through suffering or has lost a loved one that, it's okay, it's all working together for the good. They're in a better place now. That's not consoling, in a certain level, right? And especially if it's a random and chance hit by a bus, 23-year-old type, apparently out of the natural course, such a gifted person, such promise, cut so short. And there's so much of that today. There's so much of that, I guess, at every age. In fact, if we look back, we'd see the incidence of child mortality and so on so much greater than today. So I don't think that it's either, it's just too mysterious, or I can detect God's ways at work. There's sort of a third answer that I tend to, which is that God created this universe for some reason with a degree of freedom and chance. Quarks in the basement, undermining any absolute determinism. And free will in higher consciousness, introducing an element of choice. And that's, in fact, the story of the Garden of Eden, that we have a choice whether to eat the fruit or not. And that choice has consequences, and those consequences lead to the world outside the garden, a world in which we earn bread by the sweat of our brow, and we suffer pain in childbirth, so on. And two brothers kill each other, get in a fight. So we have this world with chance and freedom of will built into it. And it creates for a rather amazingly complex evolutionary world that perhaps is God's intention. Where it goes, I hope that I think there's sort of a direction. It's into complexity, it's into consciousness, it's moving in our own human history into a more ethical awareness. We don't believe slavery is justified under any condition. There's lots of things that we're able to do. At the same time that we mix and match and still have those motives that seem to be able to justify anything. And then we still have these chances and random occurrences that make us wonder why. Well, it still seems to make sense to me that we should not live our life just saying, it's kind of up to random chance. I'm going to drift along and just see what happens. And here is where I want to point to our third text we heard today, the Psalm, Psalm 1, the first psalm in the whole Psaltery. And it suggests that although there are elements of randomness and chance, and that even the best laid plans of mice and men gang after glee, there is a way that is in probability better than others. You know, the quarks may be indeterminate, but the statistic probability will still lead you to solid results. It's still better to choose wisdom rather than foolishness, because then you are planted like a tree by the water, instead of being rootless and drifting around, blown hither and yon by whatever winds of thought and doctrine, as one of our letters in the New Testament says. You know, cling to the teachings, cling to what you've known, the commandments, and follow the way of Jesus. And that is a better path, more likely to result in a productive and blessed life. Right? It makes sense. And if some are so unfortunate as not to prosper in the long term, well, many others will through this way of life. And if the whole world, the whole culture is following the way of Jesus, you're going to have a much better general outcome than people who are following the way of self and, you know, might makes right and kill the other person before they kill me. How much better to treat the other person as if you would like to be treated? What better world could come out of that way? And so over the large number, if more and more Christians, more and more people with ethical compasses, wise people in other words, it's not a Christian only commandment, is it? You know, Confucius said something very similar. Do not do to others what you don't want done to yourself. Kant made it a universal ethical imperative in his Enlightenment philosophy. So that way of wisdom, even in a world ridden and rife with chance and randomness, even though there are many times when we don't know which way is best, so we have to make a choice, you know, praying to God to help guide us, knowing there will be unintended consequences, knowing that no matter which way we go, we'll have to keep choosing and deciding all the way along. Still, that path, the path of the Good Shepherd who guides us, you know, through the valley of the shadow of death to the still waters and the green grass is best, that we might flourish there and we might become guides for those coming after us. And I'll conclude with, the opposite, which is, as Eliot knows in the old prayer book, we follow too much the desires and devices of our own heart. Right? Well, I always thought when I was a little kid, there's a little health in me, right? But apparently not. We're corrupt and depraved all the way down. But, we do seem to follow the devices and desires of our own heart. The world, if John's talking about the world is now trying to teach us that the way is actually sort of a consumerist self-care. Follow your passions, follow your heart, which is all well and good if your heart is, if your conscience is well formed, your heart is in the right place. But how often are we actually in bondage to our appetites and sins and devices and desires of our own heart? And they lead us, back and forth, hither and yon. They're like the random element we introduce in our life. So if we just say, well, let me go back to trying to be, what Jesus was, and to love God and my neighbor, and to try to do to others what I would want, how easier it is maybe to walk that path. We will bear the scars of failure and broken hearts, but we will also find solace in the transcendent moments of love and compassion for each other's wounds. But let's not pin the toils and snares of this world on God, nor on a malevolent evil one who is out to get us. But let's temper hope with wisdom, faith with humility, and trust God to bring us home by whatever path we end up on, random or chosen. Through the pure grace of God's love is shown to us in Christ our brother and guide. Lucky you, lucky me. Blessed God, blessed we. Amen.